Welcome to the 28th episode of the Tertius Times podcast. Today is Wednesday, September 29th, 2021. I'm your host, Brian Wright, and today we will look at fallout from the protests in Cuba earlier this year, Christian persecution in North Korea, and recent attacks in central Nigeria that killed 49 people. There is no interview segment for this week, but I am in communication with someone who has done enormous work on behalf of the persecuted church. God willing, that interview will be available soon. On Wednesday, October 6th, USCIRF will present an update on at-risk religious communities in Afghanistan. I attended the previous USCIRF hearing, Strategies for Religious Freedom in Fragile States, and found it very informative. I would encourage you to attend this upcoming event as well. In this Wall Street Journal editorial from September 19, 2021, written by Dr. Oscar Bisset, 2007 Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient and a Cuban physician and human rights advocate, is a plea that freedom for Cuba's residents inspired the protest earlier this summer. He begins by telling a bit of his own personal story. He was arrested in 2003, quote, during the Black Spring crackdown on political dissent, unquote. He, along with many others, was freed in 2010. But most of those released were immediately exiled to Spain. Bisset refused exile and found himself spending another year in prison. Although many media outlets painted the Cuban protest as being against the government's handling of COVID, the economy, and, quote, the lack of medicine and basic food, Bisset emphatically states, the protests are fundamentally about repression. The protesters are demanding accountability and transparency from an autocratic, secretive government. They are demanding freedom of the press and religion from a regime built on propaganda and intolerant atheism, unquote. He states, quote, Cuban security forces and civilian communists beat many protesters with clubs and sticks. By one estimate, more than 700 people are still being detained by the government, and perhaps dozens who were apprehended remain unaccounted for, unquote. Bisset adds that in conversations with friends back in Cuba, the protest turned out to be synchronized, spontaneous events. Average people would just go to a park, for example, and happen to meet others there also protesting. After pointing out the USSR model Cuba was based on, he states, quote, just like the USSR, Havana tries to control every aspect of its subjects' lives. It's an Orwellian state where citizens have been conditioned to distrust one another. Despair hangs heavy in the air. Even a whisper against the government can provoke harassment, beatings, detention, and job loss, as it did for me, a physician, and my wife, Elsa, a nurse, after we began speaking out decades ago against the regime's abuses, unquote. He is determined, like so many other Cubans today, to voice their displeasures of the government and have had their hopes kindled by the massive protests of their countrymen. Pray for Cuba that those who long to breathe the air of freedom may continue to be strengthened and encouraged by the protests that broke out across the country. Pray for people like Dr. Oscar Bisset, who work tirelessly toward their dreams of an unencumbered Cuba, that they also remain strengthened and hopeful that their work will change things for the better. Pray that that spirit continue in the hearts of all Cubans. Pray for the government of Cuba, that the leaders would appreciate the desires of their people and have the humility to grant freedom of speech and freedom of conscience to all its citizens. Pray that the church in Cuba works as an impetus and inspiration for the fulfillment of tangible and intangible freedoms the people are yearning for. It's been long known that North Korea is incredibly intolerant when it comes to issues of freedom of conscience, and particularly with religious issues. This article, North Korea Intensifies Christian Persecution by Portraying Them as Blood-Sucking Monsters, September 29, 2021, from Christianity Daily, clearly illustrates that fact. As the article puts it, quote unquote, intense persecution awaits those who discovered to be believers of any stripe, except, of course, and the dear leader first and foremost, and in communism secondarily. Citing both CBN News and USCIRF, the article points out that, quote, the North Korean regime is designed to remove all traces of Christianity and details how the campaign to exterminate all Christian adherents and institutions has been brutally effective, unquote. For example, the promise of promotion awaits those in the secret police who, quote, apprehend Christians and other believers, unquote, thus incentivizing brutality. According to a USCIRF report, quote, those charged with Christianity often face execution or are forced to live out the rest of their lives in political prison camps, unquote. This article adds that, quote, Christians are targeted the most for persecution because of the ties to the US and Europe, unquote. Quote, young children in schools are taught that Christian missionaries are spies of the countries who seek opportunities to invade North Korea, unquote. And another report indicated, quote, and are even shown graphic images of missionaries sucking the blood of children to show how malicious they are, unquote. Children are also told religious believers are murderers, spies, and where Bibles are displayed as trophies taken from the enemies of the state, unquote. The article concludes by suggesting, based on expert appraisal, that targeted sanctions can be an effective way for persecution to ease up. This is based on the idea that North Korean leaders care about the image of the country to the rest of the world. And this very well could be the case since the country, quote, responds so aggressively to Human Rights Council resolutions that condemn their human rights record, unquote, and why, quote, they push back so hard against human rights sanctions, unquote. Pray for Christians and all religious adherents in North Korea that they will be protected as they practice their rituals and will be granted the ability to openly meet together without fear of government interference. Pray for all of the North Korean people that they will not succumb to the powerful propaganda of the state in its portrayals of people of faith, and that they will realize freedom of speech and freedom of conscience are essential human rights and demand the state recognize that. Pray for the leaders of North Korea that they will come to realize the dignity of each person and the value each individual possesses, especially in their minds and spiritual lives. During September 26th and 27th, quote, at least 49 people have been killed and 27 were abducted in attacks, unquote. In 3 different southern communities of Kaduna State, central Nigeria, according to 49 killed and 27 abducted in southern Kaduna attacks, September 28, 2021, from CSW. These allegedly well-planned attacks by nearby settler communities mostly targeted the indigenous inhabitants who are largely Christian, and the Catholic priest who witnessed one attack referred to it as, quote, a massacre, unquote. According to the article, in an attack that killed one person, quote, the victim and most of the abductees are members of the Evangelical Church Winning All, ECWA, unquote. Calls for increasing security in the affected areas have been made by many, but it has been pointed out that, quote, settler communities, unquote, where the attacks originate in southern Kaduna State have been the most protected to date. In a related article, Fulani Muslims commit atrocities in Nigeria, one man's story, September 8, 2021, from RAIR Foundation USA, citing persecution.org, quote, the Fulani militia is the 4th deadliest terror group in the world and has surpassed Boko Haram as the greatest threat to Nigerian Christians. According to Christianity Today, quote, 3 in 4 martyrs are in Nigeria, unquote. The article concludes with a list of those killed during the recent violence. Pray for Nigeria that the violence would cease. Pray for those ethnic minorities that they would be protected and remain safe and free in their own land. Pray for the government that its leaders are given wisdom to effectively handle and prevent the growing levels of violence in Kaduna State and other parts of the country. Pray for the Christians in Nigeria, who make up a staggering 75% of all martyrs worldwide, that they too are protected and remain safe. Pray also that their sacrifices become the seeds of a growing church that blesses Nigeria and ultimately brings that peace that only God can provide. I want to briefly announce again this valuable free online event by USCIRF, Update on At-Risk Religious Communities in Afghanistan, and encourage all listening to attend. I also want to remind everyone that the previous event, USCIRF Hearing Strategies for Religious Freedom in Fragile States, has been posted on YouTube. The links are in the description. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you found the information and interview presented here useful and that it encouraged you to pray for these people in areas of concern and perhaps even inspires you to take positive steps of involvement to alleviate the suffering of so many around the globe. Continue to pray for those mentioned today as you are led. Finally, pray with me that God's peace, eternally beyond our comprehension, guards the hearts and minds of all those who follow Christ and flow outward to bring that peace to all the world.